Onassis Foundation.
Dublab.
Welcome to the Quarantine Tapes, a daily podcast from Onassis LA and Dublab. Hosted by Paul Holdengräber, this series chronicles shifting paradigms in the era of social distancing.
Hi, it's Suzanne.
Hello, Suzanne Nossel. Thank you so much for taking my call.
Good to speak with you.
So tell me, how have you been spending these last 7 months of this delirious time?
Well, it's been busy. You know, running Penn America, I would say, has not let up for a minute. We've had to transform, obviously, like everybody else, to becoming a totally virtual organization, with everybody working from their dining tables and bedrooms. Younger people have gone back to live at home. And holding it together, keeping people connected and in communication and coordination has just taken a lot of extra effort. And then figuring out program by program, okay, how do we now reinvent this for the virtual world? What does a virtual Penn World Voices Festival look like? How do we do our Penn Out Loud event series virtually? How do we do the Penn Awards virtually when we can't have books coming into the office and being shipped out to judges, doing all of our advocacy and protecting against threats to free expression in this stepped up environment. So, that has occupied an enormous amount of brain space. At the same time, I have two teenage kids who are, now back in school, one 100% remote, the other in a kind of crazy quilt hybrid system. And so just making sure that the family is okay, aging parents and relatives, just a lot to hold together. A lot more housework than I ever did before as well.
Yeah, and it's so hard for organizations at this point to figure out how to do what they did before during this time. And in a way, you've already answered the question, but I might ask it again. What has Penn been up to during this pandemic that you think is most remarkable?
We have innovated in a lot of ways, and I'll give you just a few examples. So we have a whole program that's devoted to defending free speech on college campuses. And of course, so many of those campuses have emptied out entirely, and some of them, where students are on campus, they're not going to class in person. And so we've had to reinvent that. So this summer we ran a summer free speech institute, and we had 100 kids for a 2-week intensive. And it was something we'd always wanted to do, to have a program directed towards students. And kind of the pandemic made it possible, to be honest, because we were always stymied by the idea of, renting a dorm and all of that sort of fell away. And then run up to the election, we've done work for the last 4 years on the threat that disinformation represents to free expression. And that has stepped up enormously. So we have this campaign called What to Expect When You're Electing. And the theory being that the better prepared people are for the ways in which this election will depart from what's normal, the more inoculated they will be against conspiracy theories and the spread of disinformation. So we've been doing trainings and videos and closed-door convenings with news leaders. We did one with the decision desks of the AP, Fox News, and CNN last week. So that has been a huge mobilization. But kind of program by program, we've had to reinvent.
Suzanne, you've written this book, which has just come out, really, Dare to Speak, Defending Free Speech for All. As you see it, what are the main threats to free speech at this very moment?
Look, the primary threat in this country, I believe, has been this administration, which has run roughshod over the First Amendment, threatening and retaliating against journalists for critical coverage. We're responding right now to an announcement that they may be sanctioning some of the partner organizations that we work with, very respectable organizations like Oxfam and Human Rights Watch, that this administration is smearing as not credible. And, left and right, the denigration of groups, whether it's on the basis of race or gender or immigration status, intimidating people from speaking out, the uncorking of hateful speech throughout our society, excused and sometimes enabled from the White House, has created a climate where free speech is threatened. Critics of the president and those in power are at risk of being punished. And it's also triggered a virulent backlash where people feel, well, if this country is going to be an enabling environment for hateful speech, then we need to double down and police it in our classrooms, our organizations, our magazines, our campuses. And, that too, coming from the left, is a genuine concern. But I think, the root of it really does come from the top. And we have a lot of work to do. The other thing I would spotlight is just the complete erosion of trust and truth in our country, where no one knows what to believe. And we're thinking hard about, even if we can turn the page on this political moment, what will it take to restore faith in fact-based discourse? Because that has been substantially undermined.
What will it take?
I think a lot. I think, really faithful, religious adherence to facts by our leaders, transparency. I think here in New York with the pandemic, we actually do have a good example in how Governor Cuomo handled this, doing his daily briefings, the statistics that are released day in and day out, which are believable. As a New Yorker, you can feel right now that what's happening with the pandemic minute by minute. And I think that's one of the reasons why we've been successful here, relatively successful in curtailing the pandemic, because people understand what they have to do and they trust their leaders. So I think that's one example. I also see a role for writers and intellectuals to help us process the trauma of, the last 4 years and particularly this year, and analyze it and begin to bridge across some of these divisions. The polarization of the way that we absorb news and information has become so profound that we have conspiracy theories that are spreading like wildfire, and you can't even see them from where a lot of us sit. And so opening up opportunities to talk to our neighbors, to bridge across ideological and political divisions, I think is going to be extremely important.
You've done so much work on the decline of local journalism. How bad do you feel the problem is, and what can an organization such as yours, like PEN, do to help local journalism really survive?
Yeah, look, that grew out of our effort over the last few years to dig in more deeply with our members across the country. And when we talked to them about the free expression issue that they were most worried about, many of them said it was the erosion of local news. Their newspapers had shut down, newsrooms had been slashed, there were no more investigative reporters covering the city council or the state house. And so we documented all of it in this big report, Losing the News. And we put together a series of recommendations. One that we are focused on for next year is the creation of a congressional commission that would re-examine the role of public funding for local news, because the size of the gap, it's about $30 billion in revenue that has disappeared with the migration of advertising from traditional news outlets to social media platforms. And a hole of that size is never going to be filled by philanthropy or even creative business models. So we think public funding has got to be part of the solution. It's not a perfect or a complete solution, that has to be said. But what we really tried to underscore in this report is that this is a deficit for democracy. democratic accountability just evaporates when nobody is applying scrutiny.
In 2015, Penn gave its Freedom of Expression Courage Award to Charlie Hebdo, a decision criticized by over 200 writers. I know some of them, including Deborah Eisenberg and Michael Ondaatje and Teju Cole. When you reflect back on that episode in particular, would you have done anything differently?
I think where we fell down a little bit was in being able to anticipate the reaction, because we made the decision. It was right on the heels of the killings, and it was spontaneous. And, we all felt a sense of unity and pride in that decision. And we didn't do as much research as we should have done. And I think if we had done more, we would have not changed the decision, but been a bit more ready to take account of possible criticisms. And it's actually something that I touch on in my book, kind of working in a global environment. You really have to apply a lens of conscientiousness and think through the various constituencies that may respond to what you say and do. And, it's not just a single kind of reasonable man standard. Everybody is different. And, that is a responsibility of an organization. So I think that's something that we've learned and that we kind of think about more, these days.
One of the topics you write about in your book, Dare to Speak, is the rise of fact-checking on online platforms like Facebook and Twitter. To what extent are you concerned, Suzanne, by the possibilities this creates actually for censorship and abuse?
I am concerned. I think we need to be very vigilant about that. These platforms exercise such sweeping control over large swaths of our discourse, and they're so influential in terms of what gets elevated, what takes hold, what goes viral. And, they're not just neutral chalkboards. They are elevating, amplifying, accelerating, all kinds of news and information. I think, we've seen in recent months, if you didn't believe it before, I think you believe now, there are genuine harms that are intensified by the ways in which information spreads online, whether it's COVID-related disinformation or political propaganda from the outside, active measures to influence our election or undercut our democracy. These are real dangers and threats. At the same time, I think there should be grave concern about the idea that these platforms can just exercise unfettered authority and autonomy to police speech as they see fit. They're private companies. They have their own profit motives. They're not transparent. We know from history they don't tend to do a great job with this. They're buggy. They cut corners. And so I think it's a real balance. What I anticipate is that the regulation and moderation of content is going to become substantially more aggressive. I think we're already seeing that. It's being demanded by internet users, by regulators, by advertisers. So it's going to step up. And I think we need to, at the same time as that happens, put into place much more robust safeguards for people who believe that their legitimate speech and expression has been infringed upon. So that if your post disappears and you think, this is outrageous, there's no way I've violated Facebook's terms of service, you have an immediate recourse. You can actually get to a human being and have your rights upheld because
wouldn't that be nice?
They're really in the balance.
Just a few weeks ago, Suzanne, Daniel Ellsberg said the following about Julian Assange and his ongoing extradition trial. If Julian is extradited to the United States to face these charges for doing the journalism that he has, with the charges that are made against him, no journalist in the world is safe from life imprisonment in the United States of America. The possibility of freedom of the press and thus of democracy is at stake all over the world in this. That sounds almost certainly like hyperbole, but it isn't. I'm wondering, Suzanne, do you agree with Daniel Ellsberg?
Well, I think the charge that is most concerning for us is under the Espionage Act, that the act of receiving information that could compromise national security, can itself be the basis for a criminal prosecution. And this is an act that's been used very sparingly, and some of the early uses of it have been discredited as really efforts to suppress dissent and burnish the government's image at the expense of free expression. And so I think, as we see it, it is impossible to distinguish the actions that Assange took that are the basis of the Espionage Act count of the prosecution from the work of other journalists. This is what journalists do. They get information from sources, and those sources in some instances, may be leaking, may be unauthorized to share that information. This is how we know what's happening in wartime. This is how some of the most important revelations about the misdeeds of our political leadership wind up seeing the light of day. So that's an extremely important function that the press plays. And even though, in the count, they're not specifically going after journalists, I don't think it's possible to discern a line that would protect a journalist if a prosecution on a count like this, were to go forward and be successful.
Did you think of including Julian Assange in Dare to Speak, or was it an intentional, one might say, omission?
Not really, only because there's so much of Penn's work that I don't deal with. I don't really deal with issues of press freedom in the book, except kind of in passing. The book is really written from the perspective of an ordinary citizen and kind of what you can do, and I argue should do, as a civically minded person to do your part to defend free speech. And it has to do more with the issues that you confront in daily life. I don't expect people to necessarily go out and be an advocate on behalf of some of the writers around the world, who are languishing in prison. We do that work at Penn, and it's extremely important. But, I would love for people to become members of Penn and support us in doing that. But, I also think there's a lot you can do just in daily life, whether it's in the boardroom or across the dinner table or in the classroom, to hold open the space for free speech and open discourse.
Earlier this year, Suzanne, Penn released a report I found very interesting called Arresting Dissent, Legislative Restrictions on the Right to Protest. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about your findings, and also what is Penn doing, do you think, to preserve the right of Americans to dissent?
Yeah, we started to get very alarmed at this pattern that we saw of state legislatures adopting new laws to restrict protest rights, whether it's, where and when and how you can protest. You can't protest on highways. You can't protest in front of civic buildings, et cetera. And this really came in the wake of the Women's March, the airport protests, and the uproar that arose in the early days of the Trump administration, where people were taking to the streets much more visibly and forcefully. And you saw predominantly Republican legislatures trying to use their power to shut down those rights. And assembly rights are, of course, protected in the First Amendment. And so the effort of the report was to document these creeping infringements and to call it out, and to also provide a blueprint for those planning and executing assemblies and demonstrations for how to defend their rights. And it ended up being issued right on the eve of the George Floyd protest, the protest for racial justice that erupted in the wake of his murder. So it became kind of pressingly relevant. And we did a whole series of trainings for activists and journalists about their rights in the context of protest. One of the most disturbing things we saw in that kind of uprising of racial awareness and calls for racial justice was just gross and widespread abuses of press freedom rights, with journalists being arrested, detained, sometimes roughed up by police. And so there's a lot of work to do to kind of reinstantiate the place of protest rights amid our First Amendment freedoms. I think, unfortunately, municipalities, state legislatures, police forces have sort of lost sight of some of this, and it's, it needs to be reinforced urgently.
Suzanne, in closing, in December 2016, Trevor Timm, executive director of the nonprofit Freedom of the Press Foundation, said, Obama has laid all the groundwork Trump needs for an unprecedented crackdown on the press. Would you agree with such a statement? And to what extent do you see the war on whistleblowers as a bipartisan effort?
I don't agree with that. Look, it is the case that the Obama administration was tougher on whistleblowers than pretty much any administration prior. We did a whole report on the gaps in whistleblower protection, and I hope that's an issue that Biden administration may, if it comes into power, may return to. So that's true, but I think Trump, with his attacks on the press, calling the press the enemy of the American people, denigrating individual journalists, spreading this idea that any critical coverage is fake news, seeding his supporters with the notion that serious, credible journalism cannot be trusted, and is simply a vendetta out to get him. That goes far beyond and is using and being the number one spreader of disinformation. I mean, this just, leaves President Obama in the dust. I mean, he had, a couple of significant shortcomings when it came to press freedom, but this is a full-on assault, and I think it's pretty outrageous, frankly, to equate them. But that was some years ago, so
it was.
I don't know what Trevor would say now.
Yeah, it's 4 years ago. Suzanne, before I let you go, ending with a quotation by Salman Rushdie that I'm sure you know very well, but I'd love you to wrap up our program by commenting on it. Salman said, "What is freedom of expression? Without the freedom to offend, it ceases to exist." How do these words resonate for you right now?
I think that's true. And I think we do need the freedom to offend. That doesn't mean, it's licensed to offend or that we should choose to offend all the time. I think we should be judicious in how we speak. And when we want to exercise that freedom to offend, we should have the space to do it. But, I think the kind of descent into vitriol in our discourse, actually all that does is embolden calls to curtail the right to defend, because it sort of seems like offense is running rampant out of control. I think offense is absolutely, our right, but it needs to be in its place, and we don't want it to be the dominant trope of our national conversation.
Suzanne, it's been a pleasure talking to you, and all the best. Stay safe, and I hope that soon you will be able to get back to work in a normal way, whatever that might mean now.
Thanks so much, Paul. Great to talk with you. Be well.
Be well, too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
To support this show and Dublab's progressive programming, go to dublab.com/support.